The conservation paradigm has shifted and continues to shift. In Sri Lanka, there tends to be quite a traditional approach to conservation as compared to many other countries in the world. And I think it is very important to be both cognizant of that, but also respectful of the fact that a lot of people still perceive the concepts of bankability or commercialization or markets in relation to nature as something very bad. And there's still a way to go on that, as you've alluded to.
The use of proceeds is one of the most important thing where you need to bring the good governance practices into it. And what we have seen early days, it's a kind of a free money for the government to use at their will, right? So we have seen it's been politicized, and there are a lot of criticisms as well. And of course, there have been some what you call the asset-linked swaps as well, where the bilateral the debtors have some sort of a control over the biological assets, the access and control and stuff. So we have, inspired some sort of the controversial situations in some of the countries.
When you're in the situation of debt distress and you're trying to restructure debt, bringing in additional layers of complexity through an already very complicated process can cause a lot of friction and cause delays that would undermine the overall objectives of getting the restructuring process done in a effective and timely manner.
Hi everyone, welcome to this next panel in our series on a nature positive economy, a collaboration between the Center for a Smart Future and Echelon. Today we have three very insightful and knowledgeable panelists who are going to talk to us about to what extent can sovereign instruments linked to nature, like DebtforNature swaps that have been getting a lot of attention these days, play a role in Sri Lanka's economic recovery, and particularly play a role in supporting not just the debt restructuring, but also unlock new sources of capital for conservation and for Sri Lanka to achieve its numerous environmental objectives. So with us, we have Lucy Emerton, who is an environmental economist and works in many different countries on ecosystem valuation, conservation finance, and she's a technical and policy advisor. We have Ranga Pallawala, who is currently with the EU Switch Asia program in Bangkok. We're very happy that you're here with us for this series, Ranga, formerly with the Commonwealth Secretariat and now functions as an international climate policy advisor. And of course, Deshal De Mel, who is an economic advisor at the Ministry of Finance and playing a crucial role in the economic recovery and reform program. So today, folks, I thought we'll start off with Ranga and Deshal first. We've heard a lot of discussion in Sri Lanka over the last few months, over the last year, from different groups around the role that nature-linked financial instruments, sovereign financial instruments, could play as part of the debt restructuring. Now, we know already the debt restructuring is quite a complicated affair. So I think more generally, without specifically initially talking about Sri Lanka, Ranga, overall, what's the potential for these kind of instruments, sovereign debt instruments linked to nature, to support a country's debt sustainability, support a country's economic recovery efforts?
Of course, there's a high potential with this, and we have seen a lot of good examples in the recent past across the world. I personally worked in Belize on the similar efforts, and we have seen so many other countries moving into this. Most recent examples coming from Ecuador on DebtforNature swaps. So the potential is there. Of course, it has like dual benefit. One is like you get the debt sustainability, and at the same time you unlock some finance for nature and the environmental effort. So the potential is there. The one of the significant thing in this particular instrument is, if you look at the flip side, the environmental issues we faced in the world is quite challenging. And of course, we need to have a clear dent from the business as usual pathways to make sure that our environment is protected and the nature is contributing what you call the sustainable well-being of the world. Of course, the current pathways are not supporting it. So definitely we need a lot of investment to make this dent a clear dent. So where are the investments coming in? And most of the instruments we have at the moment, of course, there are potential, but there are certain areas where the conventional financial instruments might not contribute to some aspects of the environment conservation or nature or the environmental impacts. And there, of course, the governments need to chip in and bring their public investments into this. And of course, the governments, we know, with the current economic downturn across the world, the budgets are squeezed and the governments are not in a position to invest as they prefer, or we prefer the governments to invest in the environment effect. So then that means the government need to unlock some of the finances, and debt-for-nature swaps and the sovereign-linked instruments, of course, an option for the governments to unlock some of the finances and invest. As I mentioned, we have a narrow pathway based on the scientific foundation. We have a very narrow pathway to ensure that our environment is protected and the environments contribute to the well-being of the entire world. So in that narrow pathway, we need to tap into all the possible options. That's my personal view. All the possible options of financing, unlocking finances to bring in. Because if we delay that process, we'll have like irreversible impacts for the world. So therefore, debt-related or sovereign debt-related instruments might not be the only solution, but it's going to be a part of the solution, and it's going to be an important part of the solution. That's how I feel.
Deshal, these instruments are not the only solution, but for Sri Lanka, it would be an interesting departure from some of the perhaps so plain vanilla international sovereign bonds. Heard about. Ranga was talking about how we need to tap into as many different sources of capital as we can. How do you see it, as someone who has a very close view on the overall debt sustainability efforts? Is this something that makes sense for Sri Lanka in terms of timing, in terms of magnitude of money that it could unlock? Is it material to the debt sustainability side of things? And we'll, get to Lucy in a bit on the environment side of things.
Thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. I agree with Ranga's comments. I think there's a lot of potential for climate nature related sovereign instruments to contribute to Sri Lanka's economic recovery as a whole, right? So let's look at it from two angles. I think first of all, from the financing angle, I think there's a role to play, and also in terms of unlocking finance to invest in measures to address various issues, whether it's on climate mitigation adaptation and also on unlocking the potential of nature to contribute to the recovery. So if we take the first angle in terms of the financing part, if we consider it from, say, a post-restructuring scenario, I think maybe we can talk about the restructuring role later on, but from a post-restructuring scenario, if you look at Sri Lanka's debt sustainability analysis, there's an expectation that the country would return to global capital markets from around 2027. If you look at the current situation in global markets, conditions are very tight, right? So from the time that Sri Lanka started accessing global markets in 2007, we were fortunate that conditions were very mild. There was a lot of liquidity globally in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis. Cheap financing. You didn't have to do much to be able to raise cash at 6-7% for most emerging frontier markets. That situation has changed on its head in the last 2 years. So Sri Lanka hasn't actually looked at even entering the capital markets in this tighter environment. We look at what happened with Kenya's issuance of a couple of weeks ago. They raised at over 10%, and that's still less than 500 basis points above the benchmark, right? So it's a very different environment, and it's not going to be easy to raise finance the way that we are accustomed to. So in that context, I think it certainly makes sense that to explore different instruments that might be able to give some kind of advantage in terms of yield and make it a little bit easier to be able to access markets at a slightly more affordable rate. So that's where I think all these kind of instruments certainly makes a lot of sense in terms of contributing to the financing side in this new and more challenging market. Secondly, in terms of how that can contribute to, say, the qualitative change in the type of growth Sri Lanka has. So there again, so if you look at just take two examples of potential growth drivers in Sri Lanka in a post-restructuring environment, say the tourism sector and renewable energy. Both are sectors where there is potential to use certain, say, climate-related instruments to support financing into those areas, whether it is in investments in renewable energy, supporting conservation-related tourism and biodiversity-related tourism and so on. I think those are areas where financing can be unlocked. So I think from both of those angles, there's a lot of potential for climate or nature-related linked sovereign debt instruments to support Sri Lanka's economic recovery.
So on that, Ranga, I just want to come back to you, going from potential, and now I think we can broadly agree that there is this potential. It does make sense. We can talk about timing and the role in the restructuring in a moment, but we know that there is potential, but it's not as easy as saying, okay, the instrument exists, investors are there, the financing need in the country is there, and the environmental investment need is there. But there's a lot that has to be considered if a country is to go down this route, right? So in your experience, particularly when you had a intimate view of one country, Belize, going through that process, but through that as well as more generally when you see other regions, what really should we be considering in approaching this, going from potential, it's there, to actual action on the ground?
Timing is important. As you mentioned, we can discuss about timing later on. With Belize, of course, I can remember this is after the COVID, the post-COVID, because Belize is a small economy and they were heavily reliant on the tourism. And when the tourism completely stopped, the country's debt for GDP rose above 130%. So that's the country was like in the verge of defaulting the sovereign bonds, they call it super bonds, euro bonds, 500 million euros. But that's a big amount for the country. So I think the timing is important because the political will came right on time. They didn't wait until they gone into kind of a default ratings. They did the decision was made before that, so it was easy for them to convince the investors and the other financiers to come in because the risk level was low and the refinancing cost was low. But if they delayed that decision by about 2 months, 3 months, it could have been a completely different story where the refinancing cost could have been very high, and because of the risk, some of the investors might not interested to come into that scenario. So I think timing is important. So it's not only the potential, but you need to consider so many other factors as well. The appetite from the other parties who are coming into the play, and the debtor consent is also important, and the negotiations are important. But this negotiation, the grounds are completely different for different status of on the ratings of the country. So I think the timing is quite crucial. I think that's one of the best examples that I can see, the Belize timing.
Lucy, we heard from Ranga and Deshal not just about the potential, but also the role it can play in the debt sustainability piece. We also heard a little bit about timing. Deshal, talked about that second part of it, on the role it can play in actually unlocking sources of finance for conservation, more nature positive economy. I want to talk to you a little bit about that, because a lot of folks that CSF talks to, and we try to bring in both the economics and finance community, but also the environmental science, ecologists, conservationists, and environmental activist community, they're quite anxious about these instruments. Sri Lanka does not have a very good track record in managing, regular sovereign debt. Now we also have the added pressure of potentially linking it to environmental objectives. So when you hear about some of these discussions for Sri Lanka and also consider what you've seen elsewhere, how should we really be thinking about this in achieving that second objective, equally or probably even more important for a country like Sri Lanka on the environmental outcomes we want?
I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And, as both Ranga and Deshal have intimated and you have, there's still quite a polarization between the environmental conservation community and the finance and economic community. We've got to find ways of bringing that together if we're going to harmonize those goals. But I think it's also worth noting, I've observed it here in Sri Lanka, but also in the other countries that I've worked in, there's a lot of talk in the environmental community about debt-for-nature swaps. And we have to remember, let's look at it in context. These are nothing new. From the late 80s, there was a huge trend, sort of late 80s into the 90s, there are a lot of debt-for-nature swaps. A slightly different model. It was swaps. It was mainly buying off debt and then using the proceeds to capitalize some kind of a trust fund. What we're seeing now, I'll talk about it in a moment, is a little bit different. It's still to do with debt and it's still to do with financing conservation, but it's being managed a bit differently. So it's not new to the conservation community, but there are very polarized views, as we see in Sri Lanka as well. There's an inherent suspicion of these big ticket, big money financing mechanisms. There's an inherent suspicion among, normal people, myself included, as an economist, of debt. As soon as you use the word debt, it's very loaded. And if you are coming from a background where maybe the nuances of public debt and how it is used as a tool for economic management is not so clear, it leads to a lot of inherent suspicion. Then when you throw in the international community and large amounts of monies and billions and millions of dollars, I think almost every country I've worked in, there is a great deal of suspicion. On the other hand, there are those elements in the conservation community who see this as a silver bullet. And that's largely because of the huge potential that is undoubtedly there of debt strategies to free up what in conservation finance terms are huge amounts of money. But I think, maybe the main talk in the conservation community is how to use the proceeds, which is also very polarizing. And there's a great deal of suspicion. I think we'll come back to that, talk about the financial management mechanisms and trust funds that are typically set in place. And we now reach a situation where it is interesting, that debt restructuring for nature, climate, biodiversity is coming back onto the agenda again. It's got a lot of traction even with international donors, with the conservation community, but it's very difficult. Rather than using public funding and mainly doing bilateral swaps, we're now talking about refinancing debt primarily on private capital markets through bonds, which is a very, very different thing. And it's a much bigger thing. In the sort of late 80s, 1990s, there are about 140 debt swaps, and they raised about $4 billion for nature. That's one important thing. There are a lot of debt swaps. It wasn't a huge amount of money, either in debt terms or conservation finances. Now, Ranga was talking about this recent slew of new bond-backed debt restructuring. And so moving from, I think, in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, average was about 26.6 million per deal. That's not a huge amount of money in finance terms. We're now talking about Seychelles was a real forerunner of issuing a blue bond, converting debt. That was about $15 million. Ranga talked about Belize, which was 300 or 400. And now we're talking about Ecuador, which you also mentioned, the so-called Galapagos bond, which is $500 to $600 million, leveraging buyback or conversion of, I think, 1.6 billion of debt. So we're now dealing with something that's even more complex and big money. So potentially, just looping back to where, you came in, which is how the conservation community sees this and how we bring together the environment side and the sovereign debt management side. We have a much more complex series of factors to deal with, much more money, much more potential for misunderstanding, and potentially much more polarization, which I think just underlines the critical need. If we're talking about debt for climate, debt for nature, then climate and nature is integral to that. We have to bring all the players around the table. And in most countries, that's come relatively late in the day. I think to the detriment often of these deals being accepted and understood.
So Ranga, we have the opportunity to do it differently, given that we are a relative newcomer to this, and we already know some of the cautionary notes that Lucy hit, right? So have you seen any among the countries you worked and some of the countries you mentioned, have you seen any interesting efforts to try and bridge this gap in understanding, reduce the misunderstanding, or do you agree with Lucy that this gap continues to exist? You talked about Ecuador now. You had some experience in Belize. Did you see anything being done in these countries that tried to bridge this gap?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, as Lucy correctly mentioned, of course, the debt for nature climate swaps has evolved a long way since 1980s. I think Belize also has done one swap long time back. Earlier it was like bilateral debt swaps, but now it's coming into more to the private bond-based swaps. I think it's mainly because of the amount of proceeds and the amount of gains that you can generate out of it. One of the lessons that I've seen is, of course, the use of proceeds. Is one of the most important thing where you need to bring the good governance practices into it. And what we have seen early days, it's a kind of a free money for the government to use at their will, right? So we have seen it's been politicized, and there are a lot of criticisms as well. And of course, there have been some what you call the asset-linked swaps as well, where the bilateral the debtors have some sort of a control over the biological assets, the access and control and stuff. So we have, inspired some sort of the controversial situations in some of the countries. And of course, some countries have learned out of it. And of course, having conservation funds or national funds came based on that discussions, but we have seen still there are a lot more things you can do. And some countries, of course, and even some of the donors are looking at it in a kind of a different way, rather than use money as a kind of a direct investment, how to use as a co-financing, where you can attract some of the other or mobilize some more finances into it. For example, Green Climate Fund is now looking at debt for climate swap as a potential instruments under their portfolio, where some sort of a swap, the proceeds of the swap will be used for co-financing, and the Green Climate Fund is trying to, put some more capital upon it. So make it a kind of a big investment. So that's an option. And there are some discussions going on, especially in the Latin America and the Caribbean region, where the EU ECLAC is looking at establishing what you call debt for adaptation financing instrument. So they can use the proceeds as a co-financing, so they can fund kind of a large adaptation initiatives. I think it's good in terms of the environment perspective. As I mentioned, the environment issue that we face is huge. You can't just cover it up. It's not about the economics. It's not about the debt sustainability we are talking about. It's about a bigger problem of environmental sustainability, because without having environmental sustainability, you can't think of sustainable economic growth or a social well-being. So therefore, that balance is quite important. But unfortunately, I would say the adoption of or learning from the previous examples from the countries are not that great, I would say. During the last, say, 2 years, of course, it's a kind of the flurry of swaps happened. Debt for nature and debt for climate swaps happened in different part of the world, and most of the countries want to come into. But if you look at the model, except the quantum of finance or the quantum of debt that you were dealt with, the process and the use of proceeds look very same and similar. And the thinking of the general perception is that the thinking of the government is that it's a kind of a free money they can use at their consent. But I think this is where we need to think of how to look at it, a kind of a holistic approach, not looking at as a debt sustainability or debt restructuring tool, but how to link it with the whole gamut of environmental, social, and the economic, the prospects of it.
I'm glad Ranga brought that up, Desha, because thinking of this as a more holistic process is challenging. You have a view of how even just the current debt restructuring is so complex. So I have two questions for you. One is, when you hear from folks like Lucy and Ranga, who are closer to the environment community also, and you hear some of that literacy that needs to come into the public debt folks in Sri Lanka, could you give us a sense of how much of an understanding or at least appreciation there is for this? The second is, let's be provocative. Is it even feasible for Sri Lanka in a post-restructuring environment to go in for these instruments that are already complex, require, as Ranga said, this holistic approach, require a lot of coordination within government, not just central bank, Ministry of Finance, but Ministry of Environment and, civil society and so on. So that's my second question, really practically, if we were to think about it, how likely is it? So those are.
Yeah. No, so I think that, look, if you look at the way that capacity has evolved within at least within government, what I have seen is that there is capacity that has evolved in various different pockets, right? So whether it is in the Monetary Authority, in the Finance Ministry, in the Ministries of Environment and other nature-related entities, within those pockets, there are again pockets of understanding of technical capabilities, knowing how these instruments work, exposure to how they have been deployed elsewhere, and so on as well. But I think really the challenge that we have is in getting an institutional framework that brings these together. Because right now, and I think that's the problem that's not probably unique to Sri Lanka. It's a situation where you have the different actors to an extent working in isolation and not really being able to bring that holistic view to the table, which I fully agree is really critical to derive value for society as a whole. So I think that initial focus, I would say, must be on building that institutional capacity, and that institution would need to harness those technical skills, but I think more importantly to be able to for people to be able to work together and speak the same language, because I think that's a real gap that we see right now, and I think that's certainly a gap that is inherent in the Sri Lankan ecosystem. Again, we come back to timing, and if you look at the overall architecture of Sri Lanka's institutions relating to public debt management, to overall financial management, is also changed in a fair degree of flux. So we're having now the establishment of a new public debt management office that has all along been a slightly complex mix between finance ministry and central bank. There is now an independent role for the Monetary Authority, which has previously been a more kind of fundamental player in the debt management environment in the country. So you're adding another layer of difficulty into even the institutional framework, but it has to be done. And I think you could look at this as, either say that, things are too much happening already, so we don't want to do something else. Or you could look at it in a different way. That, look, this is actually the right time to build an institution that is able to address these issues that will be more and more important as we go along, right? So I would see it as opportune moment to build an institutional framework that is fit for purpose for the future. Whereas if you look at a lot of Sri Lanka's institutional structure, especially around finance, is largely, addressing the climate that we had in the 1990s and maybe 15, 20 years ago. Whereas now going forward, it's going to be very different. So being able to deal with instruments such as sovereign debt instruments that are linked to climate and nature in a holistic manner needs an institutional framework. And I think it's a good time to start working on those, building in all the different elements from the different disciplines and putting that together. Because if you don't have that institutional framework in place, you're not really going to have a sustainable approach to this. You might have, it will tend to be kind of transactional and piecemeal, and that typically doesn't lend to good outcomes from a long-term perspective.
Yeah, so Lucy, just to pick up on that, I think the institutional piece is really important, and sometimes folks think of it as a boring thing. It takes time to do. Let's just get this transaction done. We've had investors who are interested. We've had development partners who are supporting the government to do these things. But this is really important stuff. So from your experience in a few different countries where you've seen interesting institutional arrangements, the ability to bring in civil society, the conservation community into it. Any call-outs you can make on how Sri Lanka should think about this institutional architecture and what are the entry points for civil society, for researchers, for environmental groups to get in there? Because that's also an important part of the institutional structure, not just the intra-government part.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with Deshal about, as with any environmental financing instrument, it's about the institution. Unless you have a strong, robust, inclusive institutional setup, then it doesn't matter how good the mechanism is in theory, it won't happen. And of course, as well as, we've got many complexities in this context of sovereign debt instruments and nature finance, of having many different stakeholders involved, from the public sector, the private sector, civil society, NGO sector, the international community, the domestic community involved. We've got many different stages of the pipeline. Negotiating and brokering the deal is one very complex part, which, as Ranga says, takes a long time and a lot of negotiation between debtors and creditors and private capital markets and raising finance. But then, and this is usually the most controversial and fearful part for the conservation community, is how is that money used? So almost inevitably, and this has happened in Belize, in Seychelles, as well as the old DebtforNature swaps. This is involved endowing some kind of a conservation trust fund or a national parks trust fund or something similar, because you have a huge injection of capital that you need something. And that both demands a huge multi-stakeholder buy-in and participation, but also, if handled badly, engenders a lot of suspicion and can completely derail things. So the history that although I was really interested what Ranga was talking about, is there are other ways to do as well. Because conventionally, these have been trust funds, usually multi-stakeholder government trust funds, which are independent of government. Then rarely, if ever, have these been controlled by government. And almost inevitably, they are formed as an endowment fund where the money is invested, often offshore, and then it is the interest which is spent on conservation, not the capital. And these require a great deal of careful design, coming back to the institutional side, and a great deal of involvement of different stakeholders, which have to come on, at the early stage. And arguably, from a conservation perspective, the main focus of conservation organisations is not so much the structuring of the debt. People might have personal opinions, but not so much from a nature perspective, but it's how that money is managed and used and who controls it. It's not just the polarisation of civil society and government and the need to bring those interests, but also traditionally, and I think currently, the international community continues to play a very strong role in how those funds are governed and spent at the national level. There are big questions about national sovereignty, which are often raised. Almost always, the international community in some form is on the board of directors of those trust funds. And there are good and bad aspects to that. But it all has to be thought through and managed and negotiated carefully.
Ranga, I think Lucy brought this conversation to a very interesting part about the use of proceeds, because ultimately that is when the money has to be spent, how it's going to be spent, who decide how it's going to be spent. Conservation trust funds, some form of endowment fund, that's something even CSF has looked at. We released a primer on it. And one of the things we found is exactly as Lucy said, it's a completely new governance model for spending money that then the country might be used to, with participation from multiple different stakeholders, including international. For Sri Lanka, do you have any sage advice when structuring these kind of new vehicles, new financing vehicles, that doesn't just raise the money but gets to decide how it's spent? Any call-outs you have, any words of wisdom on how we should think about it? Some of those fundamental principles that we have to think about, that we can't shy away from, because this is the reality.
Simply, it should be futuristic. That's the word that comes into my mind. If you look at the previous swaps and the model that Lucy was talking about, the endowment funds or the trust funds came as the kind of serve the purpose of that particular swap only, right? And using it for the investments. But if you look at the current, as Deshal started in his first intervention, the entire financing landscape have changed, and the environmental challenges have changed, and of course whatever we are going to have use of proceeds should be very futuristic. And for example, we are now looking at the model, what you call the direct access modality, where the receivers or the beneficiary should reach to some certain levels of standards to receive money, especially some of the upcoming funds, including the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, are using these standards. So meeting the standards are quite important. And it's not just to serve the purpose of that particular swap or that particular transaction. How that particular vehicle can contribute to mobilizing or unlocking more finances from different other investors is quite important. It's not only the public money, but also the private sector money. So that conceptualization is quite important. What I see is one of the other big mistakes that most of the countries have done it, that they couldn't overlap their the climate and the biodiversity and the pollution related strategic action plan and the futuristic views on that with these swaps and the institutional mechanism they are bringing out. So what we have seen is these institutional mechanisms have no means of linking with the other processes. So one of the big thing is that you need to look at like a holistic. What are the new challenges we are facing? It's not only climate, it's not only the nature, it's about the pollution, the plastics, and even the financing. So how you can work it, how to work with the donors and the investors is quite important. So this holistic the approach is very crucial. It's not just to serve a simple swap transaction.
And I think I'd like to just add, I think Ranga makes some really important points there. The context has changed. And also, as we've mentioned several times, the means of debt strategies has also changed from a focus on buying off and swapping debt to refinancing it. And there's a huge difference between spending the money that has been provided by the international community and international NGOs to buy off a country's debt, where the international community and international NGOs typically has a lot of leverage because they've come up with the money, to refinancing in private capital markets, where I think this also opens the door to much more forward-thinking, imaginative, and domestically driven ways of managing those proceeds.
Deshal, to come to you on managing the proceeds, whether it's hopefully not a transaction specific fund that's set up, we even think large. Ultimately, these are new forms of managing money, and this is not entirely private capital. It will have some link to public finance. So can you imagine a scenario in which these kind of new models are possible? We already know that even at the smallest level of park fees not being assigned to our national parks, it gets clawed back to the Treasury. So not to put you on the spot from a Treasury point of view, but if you were just to imagine, do you think there's space for creating these new vehicles where the Ministry of Finance doesn't get the same kind of say that it would under a regular budget?
So it would certainly be a substantial departure from the traditional model. And I think it needs to be, right? You cannot look at it from a kind of business as usual perspective. When you look at the traditional model, everything, all of, say, any kind of loan-based proceed or debt-based proceed from raised by the sovereign would go into the consolidated fund, and that is under the sole purview of the parliament. Any payments out of debt require parliamentary approval, and it has to get through the budgetary process. So to go in that way, it just will not give you the required flexibility to be able to achieve the objectives of this kind of instrument. So it would need to create a separate vehicle, and that is possible. So it would need to create, say, whether it's a special purpose vehicle or some kind of instrument outside of the consolidated fund, where there's a contribution from the public, from the consolidated fund, along with similar contributions from whether it's a private sector, whether it is international organizations, and then the proceeds of that would be governed through a structure which is outside of the regular governance process. So it's not something that is impossible. It can be done, and I think there would be also examples of that in the current system as well. But certainly it will be a substantial break from the traditional means of financing. But that is necessary. I think without that, you're not going to achieve the objectives that we would want to see this kind of instrument really achieving.
Just a small deviation, I think, just to talk about one aspect we didn't get to, and perhaps this is to Ranga. We've been talking about the fact that this funding is out there. We need to consider the proceeds. We need to have new governance, institutional arrangements. But ultimately, where this money is coming from, new forms of investors, could you give our audience, Ranga, a sense of what they are looking for? Because as Sri Lanka goes into this as a newer entrant, what are they looking for? Because I think that there is still less of an appreciation around what is this new class of investor looking for. There's a general understanding that they are looking for impact. There's a general understanding, yes, that they're still looking for some form of commercial return. Could you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, of course. The investors have compromised two aspects, I would say. One, they have compromised in terms of looking at purely the return of their investment, because if you look at most of the impact investment financing are now coming from the pension funds. Generally, they have invested their pension funds in fossil fuel industry over the last so many years. And there's a public pressure as well as there's obvious reasons. Now they're divesting from the fossil fuel industry and the most of the pension fund, and they're looking at socially acceptable ways of investments, and so they're looking at more greener and more sustainable, more environmental friendly options of doing it. But it doesn't mean that they're not looking for any returns of it. Of course, they are looking at returns, but they have compromised on returns. Mainly because of the public views on it. Secondly, it's quite interesting to see how they see the sustainability of the investments as well. Sustainability of the investments that they have seen, for example, higher debt burden of a country means, of course, it's bad for environment, and of course, it's bad for the economy and the social well-being, and they're looking at this balance. And even if they're looking at providing debt to a country or an entity, now their risk assessment criteria have drastically changed It's gone merely from the financing and the economic perspectives to more holistic social and the environmental aspect. This is why you said there's a new investor appetite, but you need to look at it. And there's another interesting thing that I have seen with some of the investors. They don't want to displace the existing finances for it. If there's a potential to finance through the existing market mechanisms, say renewable energy, the investors don't want to fund renewable energy interventions through a debt swap. So you basically displaced a low-hanging fruit, and you potentially scale down the impact of it. So I just want to say that the investors looking at it in a kind of a bird-eye view now. It's not only their return, because their stakeholders are now more vigilant and they're putting pressure on it as well. And even the stakeholders also have invested in the funds. They would like to compromise with some of the returns, but they would like to see the holistic approach. So tapping into these investors is not easy. So you need to have kind of a criteria that spans from economic to social to environmental aspects. And these aspects are also expanding. For example, I'm just giving you one example. Few years back, there was an effort of mixing the non-recyclable plastics into road paving instruments. It looks as a very environmental friendly and pollution-free aspects, and they would like to pump money for it. But now all of a sudden you get these microplastic issues, and that's not an issue anymore. And people don't like to invest in that. So I think the evolution is happening. So you need to have make sure that your criteria is crystal clear for the investors, so they're looking at it in a kind of a very positive manner. If you can pose it like that, the investors are there.
So, Lucy, one of the things that had come out in some of our collaboration around marine conservation finance instruments, sustainable financing for that, was this idea of making the case to investors, making solutions bankable. I think some of those presentations you gave to our Knowledge Roundtable folks was quite illuminating, because sometimes it's seen as an ugly word. What do you mean bankable nature projects? There should be intrinsic value in nature. But clearly, whether it's a debt swap or any other form of instrument where we're wanting some form of commercial interest, as Ranga said, they are looking at a return, but of course with impact. So how do you think Sri Lanka should look at that aspect, and how do we build that literacy around making investable projects? And sometimes it's almost oxymoronic: conservation, investable projects, bankable projects. So could you help audience really understand how to bring those two words together, because it's important in the context of these new financing instruments?
I think the conservation paradigm has shifted and continues to shift. In Sri Lanka, there tends to be quite a traditional approach to conservation as compared to many other countries in the world. And I think it is very important to be both cognizant of that, but also respectful of the fact that a lot of people still perceive the concepts of bankability or commercialization or markets in relation to nature as something very bad. And there's still a way to go on that, as you've alluded to. Also, to build understanding. A lot of there's been a lot of hype around green bonds and blue bonds and climate bonds and sustainability themed bonds in Sri Lanka and elsewhere in relation to debt and elsewhere. But one thing that is very poorly understood at the moment among much of the conservation community is that if you are taking return-bearing instruments, they have to generate a return. And there is a difference between spending money purely on public interest goals, supporting marine protected areas, capacity and effectiveness and functioning, which I might just note there is a vital need for more finance there. But if you're looking at impact investment or bonds or other things which will generate a return to the investor, that money is really only available for return generating investments. It's not available for purely public interest investments. And I think we just have to understand it's not all one or the other. On all sides, we have to understand. And both Ranga and Deshal alluded to this before. If we're looking at impact investment, if we're looking at debt restructuring, if we're looking at anything else, it's part of the conservation finance solution. It can't be everything to everybody. And I think that's worth also flagging, even if we're talking about the billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, which for the conservation community is a huge amount of finance to be injected in. This is only going to be a small part of the conservation finance that comes. Fitch actually did an interesting study last year on nature finance, and they made the point in relation to bond-backed debt restructuring that yes, it's significant, but very much it is supplementary and complementary to existing conservation finance. It's not going to replace it, and it's not going to crowd it out. And I think that's the thing to look at these integrated packages. There's a task force on nature markets who did a very interesting study on nature finance, and there's about $17 billion worth of nature financing in 2021. Only 190 million, or 1% of that, was debt restructuring. So I think it's important to put it into context. This is a very significant tool that might or might not come about in Sri Lanka, but it's only going to be part of the solution. It's going to be one in a toolbox of mutually reinforcing finance instruments, some of which are for the public interest, all of which are for the public interest, but some of which must generate a return on investment, others of which won't, and which will also provide money to the multiple different groups and costs that need financing. No one instrument is ever going to be able to do all of that.
Yeah. So, Lucy, because we have someone from Finance Ministry here who has a good eye on the budget, what are those other instruments that we should also consider? Because I know we started the conversation, going right into the debt swaps and debt for climate, debt for nature. But if we had to zoom out in the context of what you just said about, it being part of a suite of other things, what are some of the other things that we should consider in terms of unlocking the public budget for public budget piggybacking or private money piggybacking on that? What are all these other instruments that we should be considering that we are not at the moment financing instruments?
First and foremost, it's not innovative finance mechanisms, it's the public budget. Public budget actually has to lie at the core of nature financing. Nature is a public good. Conserving nature is in the public interest. It's a fundamental responsibility and commitment of government. And it's easy to think about these big, sexy, flashy, big money, new things and forget the fundamentals. We've heard quite a lot of talk about other interesting things in Sri Lanka, payments for ecosystem services. And very often these instruments do not seek to just generate finance for nature, but also to incentivize more sustainable production, consumption, land use. Environmental fiscal reforms, fiscal earmarking for the environment. We're seeing biodiversity offset, biodiversity credit now, markets. We're seeing a lot of very interesting instruments bringing in sustainable supply chains, eco-labeling, branding, so on, which again are a combination of finance incentives. And I think we have to look at all of them because they all target different people and they're part of the mix. And maybe that's one of the things we really need to work on in Sri Lanka is diversifying, not just expanding the conservation finance base, we do need to do that, but diversifying it, bringing in many more players.
So Deshal, as you hear some of the things Lucy mentioned, what are your thoughts around how we could think beyond some of these sovereign instruments only to unlock other sources of public budget money? You were also economic advisor at a time when we had a visionary finance minister who put out a blue-green budget. There was also attempts to bring in a carbon tax. We heard this recent budget talked about, an SDG aligned budget. So when you hear all of this, what are your reactions around the possibilities that exist?
So I think it's we've had quite a lot of tendency to try to piggyback on some of the as you said, the kind of exciting and sexy words and things like that. It's not been as easy to translate that into a concrete budgetary function, right? So we are pretty good at labeling things, but not so good at converting that into action. So the carbon tax is a great example of that. And I think we've had this tendency of trying to introduce various taxes that can actually be quite distortionary, with a very good intention of trying to create something that is potentially generating revenue for a positive outcome. But the design of that is very crucial, and we have often fallen short. And I think we certainly fell short on that carbon tax design at that time as well. So really, I think the practical reality is that if you look at the way that Sri Lankan budgets operate, having earmarked funds has often failed. And that there's not a lot of credibility around that to say that, okay, we are going to raise X amount of financing from, say, a specific tax, and we are going to only spend that on, say, public transportation or conservation efforts. Those measures have not often worked because the pressures of public finance are such that if you look at the nature of Sri Lanka's budget, almost all of revenue is earmarked for interest payments, for public service salaries, pensions, essential welfare payments, and so on. So we just haven't had that structural discipline to be able to have well-designed earmarked financing of that nature. It's something we should certainly aspire to, and I think the overall fiscal reform measures that are being put in place right now are an effort towards getting to a position where you have greater discretionary efforts in terms of how you can earmark that financing. So I think first of all we need to get the design right, and have that greater flexibility and space to be able to then move into this kind of earmarked solution. So I think it can work. We're probably not there yet, but I think we're moving in the direction towards getting there in the medium term.
Folks, as we move towards the end of the session, I want to ask you guys some more forward-looking thoughts. So I'm going to start with Ranga. A lot of buzzwords around instruments: debt for nature swap, debt for climate swap, blue bond, biodiversity bond. You mentioned a debt pooling idea. What is the hot new trend that Sri Lanka is likely to be faced with as we move beyond the debt restructuring and look to tap into these instruments? What is the next one?
Interesting question. The next one, I think the first thing is we need to do right with the existing ones. But I personally think the most important thing is that overall financing strategy is quite important. We have our environmental targets somewhat there, reflected from the national determined contributions under the Paris Agreements and the MBSAP under the biodiversity. And of course, we are now dealing with the global plastic treaty and the plastic. So there are different targets coming in. But one important thing is that you need to have an integrated strategy how to implement it and finance it. And without that integrated strategy, as Lucy mentioned, the different instrument has its own niche and own the ground to play a role. So if you mix it up, if you use the right instrument in the wrong investment grounds, you're losing another opportunity. So to tap into that opportunity, so you need to have an integrated strategy. So I think it's not only the debt instruments, but all the other instruments and all the financing measures are important, including some of the policy reforms.
Deshal, to you, there's been a lot of, over the last year, workshops around sustainable finance, workshops around debt for nature, swaps. Central bank now has a green bond framework, green taxonomy. There's a new green bond framework that I think the cabinet has approved or is about to. Looking forward in terms of both timing and also looking at some of the key steps Sri Lanka would need to follow, what is your view on where all of this is headed over the next couple of years at least?
So I think from a timing perspective, the priority would be to first get the debt restructuring out of the way, because I think until that is done, it's going to be very difficult to have realistic and meaningful conversations about raising new financing at a reasonable and sensible cost. I think there's been a lot of discussion as to, whether we should have had DebtforNature swaps as part of the restructuring process. But I think what Ranga alluded to earlier as well, when you're in a situation of debt distress and you're trying to restructure debt, bringing in additional layers of complexity through an already very complicated process can cause a lot of friction and cause delays that would undermine the overall objectives of getting the restructuring process done in a effective and timely manner. So I would say the priority is to get the restructuring out of the way, and then I think it's important to work in parallel in terms of building those institutions first. Because if we don't get that institutional framework correct, it's unlikely that we are going to get the appropriate structuring of specific transactions and making sure that those are used and deployed in the correct way. So it's quite easy to get quite excited by the fact that, look, there's a potential, because what often happens is you're going to have a lot of people coming into, the government at this time and say, look, we have a great instrument. Why don't you take this on now? And it's quite tempting to fall into that and then you might even stumble. But I think it's good to get those building blocks in place, especially on that institutional side, make sure that we have our capacity in order, work with the folks in Ministry of Environment, the non-governmental entities around that, make sure we have the good mapping of what the potential interventions are, a good system of governance to make sure that once proceeds are available, that those are used in an effective and sustainable way in terms of ensuring that the public good is unlocked out of that. Get that framework right, and then you're ready to start talking to people as well. And then hopefully by that time you'd have a financial environment where Sri Lanka is able to actually raise cash at a more sensible level in terms of pricing. Because right now, external environment is quite tough. Internal environment is tough because of the restructuring. So we need to get the homework done so that within the next, I don't know if you want to say months or how long, but when the environment is ready, we are also ready to be able to get financing at the right cost for the right purpose.
Building blocks, homework, Lucy, what are some of those? It's not child's play, clearly. What are some of those building blocks we can and should be working on now? And if you had to share your thoughts to Sri Lankan environmental organizations, to international development partners who are working on this, to organizations like us at CSF, what are some of those areas that we ought to be focusing on as part of doing the homework, as part of putting those building blocks in place? So government, one factor, but the others, NGOs, international organizations. What will your words of sage advice be?
I don't know the very sage advice, but my opinion. I mean, I think it's everything has got to start off with, as Ranga said, better planning, integrated planning, and as Deshal said, dialogue, bringing the different stakeholders around the table. Because actually anything we come up with has to be based on that, a thorough sort of analysis of the needs and the context, and then getting everybody around the table who has a stake, who's potentially a beneficiary, who is potentially has something to contribute or invest, and see that what is put together is fit for purpose, is tailored to that. And it is going to be building a very diverse toolbox, which mobilizes more effective and better public finance, which leverages more private investment, but also which generates more finance for the public sector. It generates more investment and capital to influence the private sector to be nature positive, and something we haven't talked about because of the topic we've been talking about here, but has to be on the table, to leverage community finance at the grassroots level and at the very small scale. So I think that's it. And to remember that if we don't bring people on board, we can have the cleverest ideas in the world, and much of the external ideas are very clever, but actually the ideas have come from Sri Lanka and be accepted by the stakeholders. We haven't mentioned it so far, but I'll just drop it in. It can be edited out. But This is not the first time that a debt-for-nature swap has been discussed in Sri Lanka. In 2001, under the United States Tropical Forest Conservation Act, there was I think, $5 million debt-for-nature swap, which was being proposed by the US government. And that never took place for many different reasons. But one of the biggest reasons was that the civil society and NGO community was never on board. Those suspicions and fears of loss of sovereignty and loss of control over the forests and resources were never allayed. And so the Forest Department said, no, this is not in the public interest. We're not going to proceed. And I think let's not forget that lesson. It might be 23 years ago, but it's an important one.
Sri Lanka has a tendency to not learn from past mistakes. I hope this is one that we do certainly learn from. Thank you very much, everyone. We covered we started off talking about the role of nature-linked sovereign instruments playing a role in a nature-positive economy and debt sustainability. And I think we got to a place where there were some very practical lessons, very practical words of advice for different stakeholders, whether it's getting the institutional framework right and ready for a potential sovereign instrument linked to nature, whether it's learning from some of the other countries that parts of it were good lessons to learn, other parts of it were more cautionary tales. Also thinking about the suite of options, that this is just one of many things we need to be looking at in order to unlock both public as well as private capital. And the last point, Lucy, which is about, we have to work hard to build this trust and bridge any gaps in misunderstanding. And the only way perhaps to do that is to be genuine about the engagement, genuine stakeholder discussion, and genuinely link the macro to the micro, because this is one space where it's at the micro where the proceeds are going to be used, where the communities are going to be impacted or helped, where nature is actually going to be gained, the nature positivity gained from these macro instruments. So I won't even attempt to summarize any further, but thank you very much, Lucy Emerton, Ranga, Pallawala, and Deshal De Mel, for being part of this series. And what a great way to wrap up this series that CSF did in collaboration with Echelon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.